Mhm. All right. So thank everyone for joining. This we are in our social policy lecture on child welfare, and today we are accompanied by Dr. Angelique Day. She received her PhD in interdisciplinary health science in 2011 from Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. She earned an MSW from Michigan State University in 2005 and a BS summa cum laude in sociology and psychology from Central Michigan University. Much of her research focused on foster care with youth, including examining the differences in college retention rates between foster care youth and other low income first generation college students, and examining youth voice and its impact on child welfare, education, and health policy reforms. Dr. Day has received many awards and honors, including a year-long congressional fellowship awarded during the 2016 and 17 academic year by the Society for Research on Child Development and the American Association for Advancement of Science. She was assigned to the office of Congressman Danny K. Davis, where she helped develop the Congressman's child welfare and higher education legislative portfolios. So please welcome Dr. Angelique Day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If you can go to next slide, please.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry.
No, you're all right. And so I appreciate the folks here who have a special interest in child welfare. And today I'm going to spend some time talking about, kind of how I got to where I am today in terms of my child welfare policy work. And how I've kind of built that work in the child welfare space over time, and in hopes that it can aspire you to think about that as a future journey for yourselves. My first official soiree into the child welfare policy world was with Michigan's Children. As a young person, like many of you, as a young 20-something, I had the great privilege of being hired at Michigan's Children, which is a small legislative advocacy organization based in Michigan that did state level work. And they do policy work in all things children, 0 to 18. And I had the opportunity to work on their child welfare portfolio. And I was hired to do that because of, one, I have lived experience in care. So I have that personal lens, but also I worked as a child protective service worker right out of MSW school and did that for a time. And then got this opportunity to work on policy. And I can tell you, as someone who did direct service work in a public child welfare agency, it is a very policy driven profession. And that direct experience working in direct practice really led me to really see all of the policy gaps in the child welfare world. And really both that professional experience and my personal experience really motivated me to use this platform at Michigan's Children to make meaningful change in that world. And so I started way back in 2006 at the state level, and I haven't looked back since, and have been engaged in child welfare policy reform to this day. So one of the things I will say is, now that I have experience working as a state lobbyist, as well as the work I did on the Hill in the federal space, I will tell you, for those of you who are excited about working on policy change, that things move a lot faster in the state legislature than in a federal legislature. So doing federal policy, you have to be a little more patient. It takes a lot more time. There's a lot more players involved. So I would say, if as you're exploring your journey, to think about working at the state level was a really meaningful experience. And I had the great pleasure of working on many pieces of child welfare legislation, and having the opportunity to work at that time with the governor in the state of Michigan to have many of those policy ideas officially become law. I think when I talk about my state policy experience, I always talk about the first bill that I ever worked on was subsidized guardianship in Michigan, and now kinship care has become a national discussion. So this idea of, really a lot of that work was built at the state level first, way before these conversations started happening at the federal level. So I did that at the state level and did that with my MSW. One of the inspirations for getting a PhD was really observing some of those hearings that were happening in the state legislature. And I would see researchers from the various universities in Michigan invited to come and speak. And they would bring their articles and they would bring all of their research and data, like stacks and stacks of it. And I would watch policymakers on their way out after the hearing throw all of that information away. And I would hear side conversations from legislators going, God, researchers really need to learn how to give us information in a way that we can actually use it. And I thought to myself, after overhearing that conversation at the end of a hearing, maybe I could be that person that can meaningfully translate research in ways that policymakers can use it in a meaningful way. So I worked on a PhD and graduated, went to traditional academia in 2011 and found myself missing policy very, very much. And, to keep up with all of the requirements in academia, I felt like I was losing my strong connections in the legislature. And so I got inspired to apply for an opportunity that allowed me to use my research skills and my PhD specifically in the U.S. House of Representatives, and jumped at that opportunity, and hence that congressional fellowship that Reginald told you about when he was doing my introduction. And so I had the opportunity to interview with many offices, and my choice of being with Congressman Davis was very purposeful. At that time, he was vice chair of the Subcommittee on Worker and Family Support. It has been named historically as Human Resources Committee. The chair or lead legislator in that committee can kind of name it. So every 2 years it changes the names. At the time I served, the Democrats were in the minority, so he was minority vice chair. And then when the Democrats took control of the House, he was chair of that committee, and now he's back to being vice chair now that the House is now dominated by the Republican Party. But through that particular committee, Congressman Davis had a lot of power in deciding, which particular bills that were referred to his committee would get attention and which ones would be on the back burner. So having that ability to work in his office really increased my ability to not only do the child welfare work, but to influence, his decision making on what particular bills that were introduced in that committee would get attention, subcommittee attention. So I had the great pleasure over that year of working with him to write 8 bills that were introduced by Congressman Davis. And of those, 3 of them have been signed by a president of the United States. Yes, even under Trump, there's different strategies we use to get things done based on who's in power at time. But we were able to be successful in getting legislation signed into law under both Republican leadership and with Joe Biden as a Democratic leader. And so one of the things I really like about working in the child welfare space outside of my lived experience is the fact that child welfare tends to be a more bipartisan issue versus some of the other social policy passions that many students that are attending today have. And so I feel like I've had, some really great experience making meaningful change because of child welfare is something that you can find Republicans as passionate about it as Democrats. And when you can introduce legislation in a bipartisan way, you really increase your odds of seeing that particular legislation, see attention and move through the process successfully. So I did that fellowship, and then those fellowships are time limited. I probably would have stayed there forever if I had the opportunity, but alas, fellowships are time limited. So I had the opportunity to interview for a faculty position at the University of Washington at the end of that fellowship. And what's unique about the University of Washington that I really appreciate is that there are actually, two lobbyists that are actually in our School of Social Work, full-time lobbyists, that the School of Social Work, really prizes and supports. And so the idea of working at a School of Social Work that had that infrastructure was really appealing to me. Partners for Our Children is our child welfare institute, and we have one full-time lobbyist who works there at the state level, doing state level work, and then I do the federal policy work for that organization. And so that's been something that I've really enjoyed since my time there, and continue to be very actively involved in the policy space, both under Partners for Our Children and through CRISP in my role as legislative director. So I have found a place where I can both be a developer of original research and a place that supports the transition of research to the policy space. And that's kind of like a perfect place for me and my interests, passions, and personality. Okay. So next slide, please. Oh, perfect. Awesome. So one of the things that I talked about was my legislative experience. Now I want to talk about executive branch, because to do meaningful change, you have to be engaged in an understanding of what the priorities are for policymaking at both the legislative level and the executive branch level. And so there's a few different strategies that I have employed to keep my pulse on what's going on in the executive branch, and to engage in opportunities to influence some of that discussion. So the executive branch, at the federal level, that's in charge of child welfare is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, and specifically the Children's Bureau. So there's a few projects that I've been involved with them that have helped me build a relationship with both career staff and presidential appointees who are assigned to this specific unit under the executive branch. So I've been a part of advisory boards that are run by the Children's Bureau, including on the Quality Improvement Center for Adoption and Guardianship. I have played a role in the National Child Welfare Workforce Institute, which is an organization funded through the Children's Bureau and does child welfare workforce on behalf of the Children's Bureau. I also provide leadership support through the National Technical Assistance Center on Grand Families, where we actually see a collaborative partnership between two executive branch agencies, one focused on aging and the implementation of the Older Americans Act, as well as child welfare. And so that's a nice crossover between two executive branch agencies. And then I have been directly involved in many evaluations for projects that have been sponsored by the Children's Bureau. And these are national level projects rather than state specific projects. And so I've listed those there. And so, through this work, through advisory boards, through direct projects and funding mechanisms through the Children's Bureau, I have regular meetings and interactions with them. So they've gotten to know me and trust me, see me as an expert in the field, and they regularly consult with me on different things that are going on. And later in this presentation, I'll show you some examples of policies that are built through the executive branch and how you could be engaged in developing those materials and opportunities to influence child welfare organizations across the country. So next slide. All right, perfect. The next thing I want to talk about, just for those of you who need some just basic background on child welfare policy, I just wanted to kind of lay out some of the major priorities that the Children's Bureau has been assigned to implement across the country. Unfortunately, what makes this challenging is that some of these priorities and perspectives tend to run contrary to another. And so when we prioritize one, the system tends to reduce priority on another. And so we're constantly in a battle to make sure that all of these priorities see equal time and attention. And that has been a problem over the years. Okay. So
Would you like me to go back?
Oh, it's fine. You can jump here. So this slide here is kind of giving you a sneak peek, because it is only after bills are introduced that you can go on congress.gov to see kind of what's going on. So I'm kind of giving you an insider's information on what various bills are being discussed for introduction in the 118th Congress. Know that we're only 2 months into this new legislative session, so all the bills on this slide need to get reintroduced. I have 2 bills that have bill numbers on here, but those were the bill numbers in the 117th Congress. So those are not brand new bills, but those are bills that we know through conversation with members of Congress that they will be reintroducing from the 117th into the 118th Congress. So there on this list are 2 pressing issues that are related to older youth transitioning out of foster care and into adulthood. Those first 2 bills on the list. These first 2 bills on this slide are based heavily on my own personal research, and you heard a little about my research on college access and retention rates of foster youth. And this bill was one that, when I had the opportunity to participate in this fellowship, like, this is the bill I went to Congress to write. This is one of the 8 that I was able to get reintroduced in my time there. And this and after a 2-year legislative session, bills die if they don't see or get signed into law, and you have to reintroduce them. So we are in the process right now of getting this bill that's first on the list reintroduced. So HR 669, to be given a new number shortly, is designed to increase college access and retention rates of foster care alumni through the creation of targeted college access programs to support college retention and the building and maintaining of targeted campus support programs. And I know many of you, all of you as students, are worried about college debt. It's something that's on the minds of all populations, but is a particular concern for a population that doesn't have access to parental support or relatives that can support them. So imagine being someone who has no connections to parents and not having the option for a parent to even co-sign a loan for you. Less than 10% of foster care alumni complete a bachelor's degree or higher. And we know that having at least a bachelor's degree is critical to making a living wage and being able to access employer-based benefits that are attached to health and well-being. So this bill is really designed to address that gap so that foster youth can be on the same playing field as students who come from stable families that can support them in their collegiate journeys. The second bill on the list here is the Foster Youth Driving Act, and this one is literally getting ready to drop this week. I expect there'll be a bill number assigned. If not tomorrow, it'll be Monday. This particular bill is related to economic mobility. As we know, access to reliable transportation is key to successful access to college and work settings. The next bill on the list, the Foster Youth Dental Act, came out of a study I had the privilege of running, where foster youth talked to me about poor access to dental care and hygiene and how much that's impacted their ability to participate in job interviews and secure jobs. Medicaid, the insurance that virtually all foster youth qualify for, only pays for extractions when there is something wrong with a tooth. Many employers see missing teeth because of foster youth can only get extractions paid for and jump to conclusions that foster youth are drug addicted. Or let's just be honest, if you have crooked teeth, folks are not like jumping at the bit, to be able to have you represent their organization with a smile, right? In terms of customer service. So this particular bill would expand Medicaid coverage to foster youth to the age of 26. Currently, Medicaid for young people stops at the age of 18. So if you're a college-going young person and have an issue with a tooth and you have that foster care history, not connected to family, you have no resource to have those dental needs addressed in current law. So what we are asking for is to make sure that the dental aspect of the Affordable Care Act, as it's laid out for foster care youth, is the same for dental health as it is for physical health. So again, we're just asking for that level playing field. Most parented students who have the benefit of having parents with employer-based health insurance, these are opportunities that extend, through between age 24 and 26 for any college students. So again, we're just asking for equity of opportunity in terms of the health policy world. Okay. So the last legislation listed on this slide are really related to the federal advocates' child welfare race equity agenda. This is a priority of President Biden and a priority of all of his appointees he put into office is how do we make child welfare less racist, and how do we address colonialism in terms of rules and regulations and stipulations that both the federal government and states have put on tribes, and really policy built that doesn't necessarily honor tribal sovereignty, even though there's a federal right to tribal sovereignty if you are a tribal welfare system. And so these bills are really designed to address some child welfare inequities that have been going on. These bills were introduced in the 117th Congress by Karen Bass's office. As you know, she is now the mayor of LA. And so these bills will be reintroduced in the 118th under the leadership of Congresswoman Gwen Moore from Wisconsin and Congresswoman Judy Chu from California. There are also a couple other bills I did not put on this list that Congressman Davis is taking a leadership role on that address race equity and child welfare, one being focused on grandparent housing and the other on legal representation for birth parents at the onset of a child protective service investigation. I do not have a timeline for introduction of the Davis bills as of yet. The race equity agenda is really designed to fix system level problems that were exacerbated through the implementation of colonizing and racist child welfare policies that were signed into law heavily in the 1990s that have disproportionately and negatively impacted children and families of color, including the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, the revised MIPA or IEP, and then the Adoption Safe Families Act. These are policies you've probably all talked about in your coursework at your institutions of higher ed in which you are enrolled. They've kind of been the leading policies in the child welfare space. And we have a lot of research that has shown that these policies have had unintended negative consequences for children and families of color. Another major policy that you probably have all heard or talked about at some point in your social work training is the Indian Child Welfare Act. Many child welfare advocates consider the Indian Child Welfare Act the gold standard practice in child welfare in terms of demonstrating the strength of a policy that promotes cultural continuity, but it has been stifled from reaching its full potential through inadequate funding and a lack of state accountability for lack of compliance. So hence the importance of the Strengthening Tribal Families Act, which you see on this slide, which provides for the ability of tribes and states to maintain their partnerships with tribes in Indian Child Welfare Act implementation, even if the Supreme Court rules the ICWA unconstitutional. And I'm sure all of you have been talking about that or reading about that since it received attention and was heard by the U.S. Supreme Court this past November. Okay, yeah, this last slide is going back to some of the work that I had talked to you a little bit before about influence at the executive branch level and how and what you can do to kind of influence the discussion in that area. So this that last bill on that last slide is really related to addressing or talking and promoting public discourse utilizing the federal registrar process. The federal registrar is housed within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and provides an opportunity for public discourse on when the Children's Bureau or Administration for Children and Families is ready to release executive branch policy or administrative policy. There's an opportunity, a 30-day window of opportunity for the public to talk about whether or not they agree or disagree with the federal government's interpretation, the Children's Bureau's interpretation of legislation. And so there's some provisions under FFPSA or the Family First Prevention Services Act, which is the most recent child welfare legislation that's been signed into law. And there's a particular piece of it that discusses kinship-specific licensing. So just in the last 2 weeks, this federal registrar released a notice to the public to look at what the Children's Bureau's interpretation of kinship-specific licensing is looking like. And there's an opportunity for each state and child welfare experts, both in public and private agencies, to provide feedback on whether they agree or disagree with the Children's Bureau's interpretation. And so responding to federal registrar notices are one example where you as a citizen of this country can lay your voice and your expertise to provide guidance to the federal government in not just getting a bill passed, but making sure that it's implemented in the way that it was intended or the way that you think it should be. So there are two ways to influence policy through both the legislative and executive branch, and I think they're equally important for us to be involved in and paying attention to. So going back to my story about this kinship-specific license, this federal registrar notice that is out now is really focused on kinship licensing standards. And one of the biggest barriers to kinship licensing is background checks. And how long if you have a non-safety related criminal conviction, should that impede people's abilities to be able to care for their relatives' children? And so failing criminal background checks is the number one reason why relatives are denied the ability to parent their relatives' children. And so some states say if you have, anything on your criminal background check, that it doesn't matter how old it is, it could be 20 years old, 30 years, and yet that is impeding your ability, if you committed a crime when you're 18, that it is still haunting you on, when you're 60 in terms of your ability to be determined as a fit and willing relative. And so we know that is horrible. And we also know that our citizens of color are way more targeted in terms of, having, criminal backgrounds or being incarcerated, because that history of incarceration impedes ability of people to meet that federal, or not federal standard, but state standards of fit and willing relative. Grandparents should not be punished for crimes they committed as delinquents, and children should not be placed in stranger care and barred from engaging with their grandparents they know and love because of a crime that their grandparent committed as a teenager or young adult. It's just ridiculous. So the proposed regulations, among other things, puts a time period of criminal offenses in place of no more than 10 years as a way to address this gap. So, and again, we know that our families of color are much more likely to see this as a barrier to licensure, and licensure as a foster parent is critical to making sure that you get access to all the resources that you should have access to be able to successfully care for children who have experienced trauma and abuse and neglect. The other major part of this proposed regulation is allowing guardianship as a permanency option to come with the same benefits as adoption without mandating the very stressful termination of parental rights. If you look at the way that tribes implement, they have never believed in adoption. They believe that parental rights should never be terminated and that children should never be severed from their ancestors, and that you have a right to know who your ancestors are. And if I have any folks that have, had the experience of adoption on this call, you get a new birth certificate and your adoptive parent becomes your parent. And that history is literally erased by the federal government in terms of your original birth certificate. So that is a loss of connection, a loss of identity that's part of who you are. And so these lessons learned from tribes and how they have practiced successfully in their communities is something that the child welfare system in the larger space is acknowledging those strengths that are learned from tribes and would be appreciated in other types of communities so that children don't have to have that relationship severed with their relatives. And also, grandparents, frankly, don't want to become mom or dad of their grandchildren. They want to be grandma. They want to be grandpa. Guardianship allows children to experience permanency with their grandparents without having to sever a piece of their identity and who they are, their connections to their birth parents, even if they can't live with their birth parents. So, connecting the dots in terms of the race equity work I've been talking about, we have found the most success in the current climate in moving our race equity agenda forward by rallying around the concept of kinship care. Kinship care providers tend to be more likely families of color, and rallying around this cause has generated more bipartisan support and less controversy than other bills that were introduced in the 117th that were designed to address race equity and child welfare. Okay, so can we keep that slide on for a little bit longer? Sorry. Okay, thanks. So as I alluded to in the previous slide that was up, not all changes to the child welfare system require legislative fixes. And sometimes the best pathway forward is through administrative policy changes. And so what you're seeing on this final slide are some examples of information memorandums that the Children's Bureau has put out to states to clarify interpretation of federal law and guide its implementation. It's important to know the priorities of the department, as that can assist in legislative efforts in terms of preparing appropriation requests and seeing if the legislature would support or oppose a bill idea. Bill ideas that are not supported by the department have a much harder time seeing them come to passage. This is true in both federal and state advocacy efforts. So by having your pulse on what's going on in the executive branch and what they would support makes you more successful in your legislative advocacy work. So being on advisory boards or working on committees through state or federal government is an important venue and platform that you can use to increase your influence in developing these administrative policies. Okay, so we've had some comments here in the chat. So I'd love to take some time to really hear a little bit about what folks who came to the session were hoping to hear about, see if I can answer questions about things I put in the slide itself or other burning child welfare questions that you may have.
Right. There are, and once again, thank you for the presentation and, the churning of ideas and get the brain moving. I have a lot of questions myself personally, but we can probably save that for another time. As I live in the South in Mississippi, it's kind of different down here when we're still, kind of really under Jim Crow law in a lot of instances that relate to what you mentioned with, the colonialization aspect of it and the kinship of knowing family and ancestry. So, but however, if there are people who do have questions in the comments and you would like to join, please feel free to, join in and ask your question, and we can invite you on the camera or the video, shall I say. But there is someone made we have someone right there, Rachel. You're more than welcome to hop in once you get approved or verified. But there was a question in the chat that asks, in the U.S. is very straight teeth bias, and not the case in Europe. I can't remember at what portion that was.
We were talking about the Foster Youth Dental Act.
Right.
I'm assuming that comment is related to that. And so you're absolutely right. That I think I've heard other comments from other Europeans. We're the country that has a lot of straight teeth people, which is different than in most other places, because we have decided that that's an important thing that needs to be prioritized as part of, being a citizen of the United States. And there's a lot of pressure to have, perfect appearances, including perfect teeth.
Right. For the attendees that would like to be added, I'm not sure how to do it on your end, but you may have to approve or click a button that allow you to come on. But we'll still wait until you're okay. You just requested to join. We had someone to join earlier in my last session. They just came in. Let me see. Well, I don't know who does a request. So there we go. Rachel, please feel free. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm sorry I joined late, but I really appreciated going through kind of the upcoming legislation and some of the other ways to kind of get some of these things moving. But I'm curious to know, you mentioned some of the things that we have learned from indigenous cultures and tribal culture and how that's impacted child welfare. And I know that ICWA is like gold standard, but I'm curious what you say to folks who say something along the lines of like, oh, ICWA is great, but it only works because there are kind of tribal leadership and there's tribal government to weigh in on decisions. And so that's the only reason it works for that. And it cannot work, like a similar thing cannot work for other races that don't have similar kinds of governmental structures.
I think certainly unique to tribes is tribal sovereignty and government to government relationships. But the sheer, fact is that we have experts and agencies that have unique expertise, that exist and support work in the immigration field, and African studies exists on many campuses throughout the country, and so we have experts in every state that could be intervening to support whether or not a decision that was made by a worker or a state was actually in the best interest of children. And the model that ICWA shows is how do you use experts from the field to inform decision making. And that particular model, I do think could be translated, to support addressing the overrepresentation of African American children in child welfare, as well as, in more recent times, the explosion of immigrant children that were living in cages during the Trump administration. And now we're seeing, these in Russia is like taking children from Ukraine and dumping them in spots. We are seeing history repeat over and over and over again. And we are not looking to experts who understand those communities and those cultures to help with shared decision making, and that we know when we rely on those experts. And one of the beautiful things about the Indian Child Welfare Act is in court hearings, there's a requirement to use expert witnesses, right? Drawing on those who intimately understand the culture of the child in the system and can be able to speak to the best interest of the children and looking at well-being. And there's no other opportunity that you'll see backed in federal law that is attentive to child well-being. We talk about it in the Adoption Safe Families Act, but there is not one federally required measurement of child well-being in statute. We look at safety. We have tons of practice-oriented tools that provide structure to safety assessments. We have structure on what is permanency and how that is defined. We have never defined child well-being, even though it's been in statute under Adoption Safe Families Act since the 90s. And we have no data collection, no definitions for child well-being at all. And I would argue that the Indian Child Welfare Act, through the use of expert witness, is the only thing that exists in federal law that actually is attuned to this concept of assessing best interest related to child well-being in the field. And that's one of many reasons why I say, ICWA is a gold standard. It's also the very first kinship care bill that was ever signed into federal law. Yeah. And we're still advocating to support relatives to this day. And that's something, tribes have shown over and over and over again with research and practice why that is such a great thing and a less traumatizing alternative for children who are in the child welfare system.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You're so welcome, Rachel.
Thank you. Let's see if we can bring, we're 5 minutes. And, do you have another question, right? I think, no, I could not see a request. I'm trying to, there we go. Got you.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this. I also agree that the knowing what the upcoming legislation was is super helpful. I don't have this fully fleshed out. I think you were starting to get to it towards the end of answering the last question, but I'm wondering what the data collection on like harm that's done in this to children while they're in the system, like the abuse and neglect that has still happened, and also the outcomes, I guess, of emancipated youth, and how we're keeping the child welfare system accountable to that, like a program evaluation. Like I think about like if the child welfare system was evaluated as a program, it probably wouldn't be eligible for a lot of funding.
You're right.
Yeah. And so also I'm a foster alum. It's always interesting in spaces where we're talking about foster youth and then maybe the presenter's like, imagine this. And I'm like, I can imagine it. So I am foster alum. And I guess another question was like any conversations about like foster youth preference in the same way that we think about veteran preference because of the sort of disproportionality of various traumatic experiences and how that's important to have like preference to like sort of carry you through life and adjusting and acclimating. So those are my two questions.
Absolutely. I'm excited to share with you some things that hopefully will be inspiring to you and that really have only recently come to light. One is under Commissioner Jerry Milner, the best kept secret under the Trump administration. I have to say I've been very impressed with him. I don't think I've been impressed with any Republican Children's Bureau appointee more than him, actually. And has turned out to be a very very liberal kind of in a red coat. I never would have believed it if I didn't see it for myself. But one of the things that he did in his time as Children's Bureau Associate Commissioner was to create an internal organization of lived experts, foster care alum, who actually provided regular guidance to him on developing what those Children's Bureau priorities should be. And one very concrete thing that came out of that conversation and that committee that Jerry Milner started was the Quality Improvement Center for Youth Engagement. That was a foster care alumni-led advocacy opportunity. And so the Quality Improvement Center on Youth Engagement is in its second year of existence. It is a 5-year demonstration project that is run by alumni for alumni. And I'm the first alumni evaluator selected on that project because it was important that we have those with lived experience in leadership in every aspect of the work. And so there's a national committee that governs all of the products that are developed. Alumni, are literally paid to rip up and criticize everything that comes out of that project, and they really own it. And they're in the process right now at the end of this year to have that group, that national group of lived experience voices, helping states recruit and develop their own lived experience experts committees that will govern what's happening in their states related to child welfare policy and practice. So those groups are, the state levels are just now being put together, and the goal is that there are certain, the national voice has said that there are certain things that have to be prioritized by states in terms of type of permanency experienced by those with lived experience, and that group needs to have diversity in that respect, diversity of who's being pulled from different aspects of the state, that those groups should be reflective of the demographics of children in care in those states, and that they should be a representation of LGBTQ foster alum. And so there's all these requirements that the states that are involved in the Quality Improvement Center have to adhere to. And the goal is that over the next 4 years, that those efforts will be evaluated, and there'll be a big report that's shared with the Children's Bureau on what worked and what didn't work in those states, with mandates that those states have to scale up and sustain those projects after the demonstration grant period is over. And so that, I think, is going to change a lot of how stuff is done. That model that was brought to Jerry Milner is heavily based on the California Youth Connections model. And if you look in California, there's a mandate in California that there is no foster youth statutes that are passed without foster youth input. And so this is that idea of how do we scale that up nationwide? And right now we're testing it out in Rhode Island and Michigan and Nebraska and Montana. And there was purposeful selection of county-based systems and state-administered systems and privatized systems and tribally run systems. And so we have 8 different tribes that are part of that project, and heavily engagement on tribes, frankly, teaching the states, because there's if you look at the research that exists in tribal communities, again, they're much better at youth engagement, inviting kids to their court hearings, way better at doing it than states. So again, great lessons learned there.
Yeah, I'm smiling, and I just have to let you know this because I'm from San Francisco, and I was the chair of my San Francisco CYC chapter when I was 16, where we passed AB 12. So I spoke at Sacramento, and I testified to get that passed. And so I'm just really proud to hear CYC as being a model.
And so here's an alumni that was created by alumni for alumni and is now gaining national traction. So, to hear that we have made some positive movements. Child welfare has a long way to go, but there's some cool stuff happening.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And thank you for your service and what you've done to kind of keep this conversation going, and your part to make this not a California thing, but a national priority.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of the questions. We've reached our top of the 50 minutes. I think we have time for one more question, maybe. And hopefully this can help the attendees. What are some action steps that attendees can take to learn more about this topic?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I can tell you, for those of you who are currently enrolled MSW students, I did not get that job at Michigan's Children by accident. I volunteered to sit on and do some advocacy work for, like I said, as a volunteer, as an MSW student. Michigan's Children knew who I was. So when a job opening happened, they called me. And so I can't emphasize it enough. If you all want to work in the policy space, it's a small world, and they tend to grab people they know. So make yourself a known entity. And every advocacy organization, especially those that focus on, child and family policy, do a lot of work with very few people. So they will always say yes to volunteers.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Day. That wraps up the conclusion of our breakout room. Everyone give her a hand, and thank you so much for bringing so much interest and enlightenment to the conversation and to the topic as well.